Hi everybody, this is Springkeeper here today, and today we're going to talk about what life was like for people who are not participating actually in the combat itself. So it's World War II on the home front. Alright, so we're going to have a kind of a hop, skip, and a step method throughout all of this. We're going to go from country to country to country to country, and we're going to play with our major players here. Germany, the United States, France, Britain, and Soviet Union. So what we need to pay attention to throughout all of this is really kind of, paying attention, remembering, what it was like during the war for the average individual. And that's kind of the goal of this. What if you were at home? What was the war like? All right, so the first place we're going to start is the Axis powers, and really just Germany. There's a ton of Axis powers, but we're not going to get involved with the vast majority of them. We're going to stick to the simple one here. So the German war effort is, pretty easy early on. The Blitzkrieg is incredibly effective, and for the most part, if you were at home, you didn't feel any effects of the war effort. All you got to see were wonderful headlines in the newspapers about how Poland had fallen, France had fallen, and Germany was doing great. The Blitzkrieg was wonderful. But unfortunately, when Germany decides to invade the Soviet Union, everything turns bad. And what we see then, yeah, see, it doesn't turn well. What we see is a total war effort have to be employed in Germany. Every man, woman, and child is going to have to play some sort of a role as to what's going on. So if you are a conquered territory, you pretty much were stripped of anything that can be used for a war effort. If you are a German citizen, you were probably experiencing rationing. You were given a certain amount of any resource that you could have, and the rest of it went towards the war effort. We would see labor shortages in particular industries. Really, any industry that wasn't vital to the war effort probably was going to be short of a few employees because those people would have been transferred to the war effort. We will see women involved. Women aren't typically employed, but what they are the quote unquote heroic mothers. They are the people who are giving birth to the next level of German soldiers. Their responsibility was to kind of be home and have as many children as possible to increase the size of the German army as much as possible. So, yeah, it's kind of a weird situation, especially if you're a woman during this time period, but people went into it and they went in and they bought in because of propaganda. This is so vitally important to the German war machine. If it isn't for the efforts of Joseph Goebbels, who's the propaganda minister, none of this works. He was the guy in complete control of everything that came out of Germany. Every news report, every play, every movie, every book written. Goebbels had a hand in all of it. And because of that, because he was so talented at creating the message that he wanted the people to see, people bought in that, yeah, you had to ration. Yeah, you had to put time and effort into this. Yeah, this was not going to be easy. Yeah, mom should stay home and have kids. This is all part of the effort. You all should do it. Germany's great. Totally wonderful. Go for it. And it kept morale good, at least until German Luftwaffe couldn't protect from bombing raids from the Americans and the British and the Soviets showed up at the front door and started killing everyone, until then. But up to that point, it kept morale high, despite the fact the war started lasting a lot longer than people thought, and casualty lists kept going higher and higher and higher. Well, eventually, this is going to lead to the fact that Germany's going to have a problem after the war because everyone is so indoctrinated into the Nazi regime. You kind of have a situation where there's not really much you can do to correct that after the war. Everyone has fully bought in. Goebbels did his job so incredibly well that kind of what we're looking at is one of those scenarios where like, oh, we're just going to wait for this generation to die out and we're just going to work on the next generation and hope to make them not Nazis. And that's kind of the approach we take, and it's for the most part pretty successful. Alright, so what about the Allied forces? Well, let's start with the United States. Well, we are pretty much just ruling at everything. We rock. The moment we get involved in the war, the U.S. war machine starts to pick up, and we pretty much dominate everything we get involved into. But we're going to have our own form of propaganda and stuff too. But if you remember, we watched the video Superman stuff. We have Captain America, various other forms of propaganda that come out of it. We're just not going to watch them in this video. In France, they're having a bit of a different story, though. After Dunkirk, after the disaster that kicks the French out of the war, you actually have established two governments in France. Northern government is going to be called Vichy government, and it's going to be aligned with the Nazis themselves. Led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, this is going to be not directly controlled by the Germans, but for all intents and purposes controlled by the Germans. Whatever the Germans wanted, the Vichy government did. In the southern portion of France and in Britain, we have a different scenario, but we'll get to that. So let's talk about this Vichy France. Well, they kind of viewed themselves as the inheritors of the French government. They thought the Third Republic was too liberal, and that's what allowed them to get beaten. So they were much more conservative socially, and they're going to focus on very strong French nationalism, the anti-Semitism that the Germans wanted, and also very conservative Catholic mentality. And they kind of create their own version of a French fascism. I mean, it's a little bit different in that the state is not going to control education. That's going to be controlled by the church. But really, outside of that, for all intents and purposes, it's a pretty fascist government. Well, in that other portion of France, Free France, you have Charles de Gaulle. He is going to be the leader of the French forces after Dunkirk, and through his radio broadcasts, he's going to keep the people of France united and morale up as much as humanly possible. He, along with the soldiers that were rescued at Dunkirk, the couple 100,000 that are there, are going to be residing in England. And on every night, he would get on the radio and talk about how, stay proud, French, we're coming for you. We want you to be proud. We love you. We're coming for you. While at the same time, he's also sending secret messages to spies in France to help derail the Nazi efforts in the area. Well, this is actually incredibly successful, and by the end of the war, Charles de Gaulle is going to be viewed as a national hero, and really the France that's going to come out of the war is going to be built on the backs of Charles de Gaulle. He's kind of that rallying point that the French people can really get behind. All right, what about Britain? Well, Britain is, suffering a little bit. The Blitz has not been fun. You're under constant threat of attack, and the British morale just falls off a cliff. You got to remember, this is a society, a group of people that has not been invaded since the Norman conquest in 1066. No one had ever made it across the British Isles. We've had attempts. The French have tried. Napoleon tried. We saw the Spanish Armadas. No one got there. But now, with these blitzes and the attacks on London and other cities, we see the British rattled. But they respond well. They rally to the effort. And what we see is them pretty much doing whatever it took to survive. Children are moved out of major cities and moved to the countryside. This was to protect them during the air raids. We see unemployment disappear because everyone picks up something to help the war effort. Women will jump into factories as much as possible to help produce whatever is needed at any given time. And we see the British, to use a phrase, bugger on. They don't give up. They become a very hardened group of people, but it's important to remember that it's not hardened because they think they're going to win. Their goal is survival. They refuse to quit. And that's the key. They're trying to hold out as long as possible, eventually for the United States to get involved in the war. That's the light at the end of the tunnel. If they can make it to that, they feel like they have a good shot at winning. Alright, what about the Soviet Union? Well, things are actually pretty terrible in the Soviet Union. When Hitler attacks Stalin, Stalin's not prepared, and boy is he furious at Hitler for doing so. So, to try to rally the Soviet people together, he's going to establish himself as the leader of the Soviet army. But he sucks at it. He's just not a military leader. There's a reason why Lenin chose Trotsky back in the day to be the leader of the Bolshevik forces. Stalin just wasn't inclined in that way to be a good leader. He's a little bit too much of a micromanager for that to be effective. Also, he doesn't trust his generals, which is also a problem too. So we see the Soviet Union just take massive losses in the early part of the war. And what Stalin will do is kind of change his efforts. He will eventually, after really just purging the Soviet military of anyone he doesn't trust, relinquish control to those people and then focuses on building up the industrial side of the Soviet Union. He creates work camps for people to work at. These gulags will lead to the deaths of millions of people because Stalin's a terrible human being. And eventually the Soviet Union starts to stem the tide of the war. He will also allow for Eastern Orthodox religion to come back to the Soviet Union for a time to provide hope for the people, improve morale. And eventually it all works. After Stalingrad, the Soviet Union just starts pushing and pushing their way back to Germany, and the race will begin to make it to Berlin. Will it be the British and the Americans or the Soviets that get there? And unfortunately for us, it is the Soviets that will get there first. We would stop along the way to help populations of people who are struggling, and the Soviet Union just did not care. They were beelining for Berlin because Stalin wanted his hands on Hitler. Unfortunately for Stalin, he will never get that because Hitler will kill himself when the Soviets reach the outskirts of Berlin. Uh, but the war in Europe is coming to an end. But it's going to leave some really impressive and terrifying lasting impacts on the world around it. All right, thank you guys, and have a great day.